Mayank Mansingh is a Delhi-based independent researcher, writer, and curator with a focus on post-colonial histories of Indian textiles. He is a graduate in textile design from the National Institute of Design. He has been making exhibitions and editing volumes around textile histories and design practice in India for several years now. These include Fracture, Indian Textiles, New Conversations at the Devi Art Foundation in 2015, The Art of Gold at Bikaner House, Abraham and Thakur, a retrospective 25 years, New Traditions, Influences and Inspiration in Indian Textiles, a history shared from 1947 to 2017. He has also worked on exhibitions with the Registry of Saris, an organization based in Coimbatore. He has looked more recently towards the textile practices and exhibitions such as Woven Narratives in Hampi. He will talk about recent projects, and we've also discussed and will continue today to talk about the role of editorial contributions, especially in bringing together material culture and textile histories and heritage in writing practices and design education, and what forums like this can do to also bring these conversations into a more syncretic space of exchange. Mayank has also further contributed by joining organizations such as the Asia Society, where he is a member of the Arts Advisory Council, as well as at the Academic Council of MAP in Bangalore.
Thank you, Natasha, for this introduction. And thank you, Priyanka and Prateek. I'm so happy that everyone who's connected with organizing this, Natasha being such a close friend for a long time, and both of you who've given visibility to my work. I'm so happy that I can be a part of this. It's really special. Thank you. The Great Exhibition of the Works of Industry of All Nations, also known as the Great Exhibition or the Crystal Palace Exhibition, which was held in London in 1851, had some unexpected outcomes well beyond its original imperialist colonial intentions. Records of the commissions and selected handmade textiles, which were exhibited from India, along with subsequent documentation projects under the British rule, have become important references for the study of Indian textile histories, providing scholars with information related to centers of manufacture, designs, and in a few instances, even of the makers themselves. Next slide, please. It is now quite well known that It is now quite well known that the British colonial policies consciously transformed India from one of the leading suppliers of hand-woven cloth to the world until the Industrial Revolution, to both a supplier of raw materials like cotton to feed its own mills and a market for its own finished products. In most cases, such mill cloth replicated the designs and aesthetics of Indian hand-woven and hand-patterned fabrics, towards which a tremendous amount of effort and enterprise was channeled. The sample that we see here is just one of hundreds from a series of volumes put together, with the main aim being such replication in Manchester or Lancashire. Eventually, from the early 20th century onwards, the boycott of this very replicated foreign cloth became one of the key elements of Mahatma Gandhi's leadership of the anti-colonial movement for the independence of India from British colonial rule. Post-independence, some significant strides were taken in the immediate decades to recover from the devastation caused to hand production in the Indian rural economy, with a primary focus on livelihood and income generation. Next slide, please. In 1949, 2 years after independence in 1947, the Calico Museum of Textiles, India's first and till date only museum dedicated to textiles, was established in Ahmedabad, a city in the western Indian state of Gujarat. Started by a mill-owning family that had made its wealth in the manufacture of Indian machine-made cloth, it has since then sustained a consistent program of collecting textiles and of research and publishing. We see an installation view here of one of its galleries from one of its publications. The Calico Museum's publications took up the mandate of what we might see as the formal studies of Indian historical studies in English, with a close connection to scholarship on the subject emerging in the United States and Europe, where significant collections of such material were created in the 19th and early 20th centuries, and from where even today a bulk of collection making, institutional exhibition making, and scholarship on the subject, which is considered authoritative, still emerges. 6 years later, in 1955, Textiles and Ornamental Arts of India was presented at the Museum of Modern Art in New York. A part of cultural diplomacy initiatives between the United States and India, this exhibition was reciprocated with one titled Design Now in North America and Europe, which was staged in Delhi. The binary that the West had established for itself between the pre-war decorative arts and post-war design was reinforced here, with textiles forming a part of India's ornamental arts vis-a-vis design, being suggested as necessarily a new phenomena with an intrinsic relationship to industrial manufacture and production. Why this background setting becomes important before I speak about my own curatorial practice is because those of us in my generation and earlier who have attempted to focus our energies in Indian textile exhibition making are faced with the enormous concerns that such binaries have imposed on us. I was formally trained in a design school set up in the early 1960s in India, the National Institute of Design, the co-collection of which we were expected to reference comprised products from this exhibition, Design Now in America and Europe, and which looked to pedagogical experiments of Ulm and Bauhaus in Germany for its industrial design program, to the Basel School for its communication design program, and eventually to schools of Scandinavian abstraction and minimalism for its textile design program. The Design Institute was co-established by members of the mill-owning family that had earlier set up the Calico Museum. And the textile field that I entered then, just over 2 decades ago, at the turn of the millennium, largely premised 2 strands of post-independence trajectories. One of Indian modernism that took from around the world, as is evident in the choice of Le Corbusier being invited to design a new capital of the northern Indian states of Punjab and Haryana, Chandigarh, and that of Gandhi, whose critique of British colonization primarily rested on his devastation of Indian textile manufacture and an emphasis on the homespun and homemade, often seen through the prism of handcraft. In this image of the Legislative Assembly in Chandigarh, the interiors designed by Corbusier, we see an indication of these 2 strands. The hand-woven textile tapestry was designed by him and produced in a workshop specially set up for the purpose in Punjab, and takes inspiration from the tradition of wall tapestries in Europe, its aesthetic alluding to an aspect of international modernism that we are familiar with. Again, against this, we see an image of Gandhi, whose ideas for the handmade continue to endure in India well through present times. This is an image, if we can go back, by a French photographer, Paris-based photographer Manuel Bugo, who has photographed almost all, actually all of Corbusier's work from interiors as well. Next slide, please. But what of the many other ways in which Indian handmade textiles have expressed themselves? For instance, the designs on this border of a hand-woven silk sari from the prominent handloom center of Varanasi, dated to the years of the Second World War between 1939 and 45, Inti, where patterns conventional to its historical repertoire amalgamate with the motive of a warplane or submarine. We see what is even today perceived to be a traditional center for textiles, absorbing imagery from newspapers or imagined through news from the war, then making it to India through the radio. Do we see this textile then as a part of the tradition itself? Do we see this as contemporary for its time or today, or modern for its obvious Art Deco and Art Nouveau stylistic renders? Or this Kantha quilt that shows us scenes from a changing Bengal at the turn of the 20th century, where what is considered the religious or sacred and the everyday or secular coming together in ways which are beyond the norms of what is theorized and curated as the folk, the classical, urban, or rural. In this scenario, My first inquiry into the field was to rethink these hierarchies that exist themselves, particularly glaring when it comes to textiles, where the designers and craftspeople or artisans who produce these textiles are in a very, very considered hierarchy. Thinking about curation of early exhibitions from around 2011 to 17 was geared towards questioning such prevailing power dynamics that exist between the artists, designers, and the makers, with the intrinsic casteism of those who conceive and ideate being at the top of the intellectual pyramid, and those who make at the bottom mere executors of others' concepts. Presenting these exhibitions in large private or public institutions in metro cities was a way to bring attention to the very lack of curatorial efforts in Indian textiles themselves, as also to forge conversations across fields, whether visual arts, design, architecture, fashion, and so on. Next slide, please. Since 2018, my work has specifically focused on taking such exhibitions to geographies beyond, as archives to centers of textile hand manufacture where such archives and museums don't exist at all. Here, infrastructure for the kind of conservation that we expect in museums and galleries doesn't exist, nor can be expected, and thus inform short periods of viewing, but the audiences have a far more direct relationship with cloth than one often finds in urban cities. This exhibition, opening wall of this exhibition of a historic handspun and handwoven textile collection, was staged in a room in a government senior secondary school in the coastal village of Chirala in the southeastern state of Andhra Pradesh, and became the nucleus of a gathering of 300 weavers from across the country, with about 4,000 weavers from the village itself interacting with the textiles through a 10-day duration. Next slide, please. With iterations of this collection being presented in Japan and 2 other Indian venues, we see an installation view here of the Coimbatore iteration in Tamil Nadu. One soon realized that in a country where textiles form a highly legible, non-verbal language, can the performative be a conscious device to enable viewing or learning? From the time that we're born and wrapped in cloth to when we die and are covered in a shroud, fabric touches us, molds us, comforts us, offering a means for expression way beyond what is considered utilitarian. Does emotion have a function, one might ask? And doesn't it offer its own directives of intelligence, of memory, and of making connections? So while textual descriptions in such exhibitions are available to those who would like, and accompanying catalogues attempt at exactitudes of information, technicalities, and descriptions, increasingly these presentations adopt a more visual approach, where the juxtapositions proposed between exhibits are meant only as icebreakers. Curation and design have a close relationship, and groupings favor sectional narratives. Viewers are at will to create their own sequences to find something of their own, and in some cases are able to actually touch and feel textiles themselves. This installation is from an exhibition which was staged earlier this year at the Crafts Museum, a collaboration with the Devi Art Foundation, on silk and metallic brocades. In terms of subjects or themes, whether handspun or handwoven, or overviews of practices across the post-independence period, or related to specific genres of textiles, I did one on Baluchari in Bengal in 2016. My most recent exhibition was the first to consider historical body of textiles and brought up questions that I had not encountered before. I speak about this in a more focused manner through the slides that follow. On the 20th of October last month, we opened Kaat Padar, an exhibition on a genre of handwoven textiles known as the Paithani in Paitan, a small town in the western Indian state of Maharashtra, which is believed to have given these textiles their widely known name. With an original 10-day duration, the exhibition's closing has been extended twice now, finally ending today after a 5-week viewing period. Presented by the Directorate of Archaeology and Museums, the Government of Maharashtra, in association with Twam Foundation, a not-for-profit organization based in Pune, with a focus on researching textile histories of the Deccan region in India, the exhibition was staged at Sri Balasaheb Patil Museum in Paitan, one of 13 small museums run by the state government across the state. This is a detail of the border of one of the 20 exhibits, showing motifs which are a part of the typical design repertoire of this genre, with flowering creepers, peacocks, and parrots. The title takes from a popular way of referring to the draped garment in Marathi, the most widely spoken language in the region. Kat means the border, and padar, the end panel. And in such paithani textiles, much of the patterning takes place in these two parts of the layout. So you actually recognize the variety of the paithani from the kat and the padar, The textiles in this exhibition were created between the late 19th century and the early 20th with cotton, silk, and metallic yarns. And they were drawn from government museums, the museums that I mentioned within the state, all of them being exhibited for the first time in such an educational format, and also published for the first time in the accompanying catalogues. The town of Paithan or Pratishthan, as it was known in ancient times, itself traces its history back to more than 2 millennia, first appearing as the capital of the Satvahana dynasty in what is called the Deccan region of the Indian subcontinent. It was an important center for trade, and literary and material evidence trace its connections with present-day Italy, the Roman Empire. Within the subcontinent, Paithan connected the north to the south in what was known as Dakshin Path, the trade route of the south, through very, very highly profitable trade routes. This map gives us a sense of the scale of this empire's extent, covering western, central, and eastern India. So it calls itself the Deccan region from the Deccan Plateau, which is a huge geographical feature here. Next slide, please. Paithan was back then a renowned center also for the production of luxury textiles, made of fine cotton and silk, and other kinds of objects produced here, like this now famous carved figurine, ivory figurine of the goddess Lakshmi. It's called the Pompeii Lakshmi, has been found in the remains of Pompeii dated around the 1st century AD. It also interestingly gives us among the earliest visual evidences of cloth. So one end of the Lakshmi actually has some cloth. Since then, it has remained a site which has been known to have produced and traded in hand-woven textiles with almost 300 weavers today who continue to hand-weave. With a GI or geographical indicator, Bordeaux wine, Champagne, all of these have geographical indicators. The Paithani is a popular and expensive textile worn on special occasions by women in the region and by non-resident Indians from Maharashtra abroad. And this map of Paithan, just the village itself, the town now, reveals to us that most of its areas at one time involved some aspect of textile production. So you have a street that's called Sutar Gali where the metallic yarn was made. You have a street that is that of the Rangres where the dyeing took place. So while all of these producers that actually fed eventually into the weaving system don't exist anymore, they don't practice anymore, there are remnants of the kind of heights that this town achieved as a hand-producing center. In the following slides, I'll just give you a sense of some of the other textiles which were exhibited. Men's shawl in very fine muslin or cotton. The next slide. A safa or a pagdi, a draped headgear. So sometimes these can be about 20 feet long, and they actually get draped and they become quite concise and small. Traditionally, all of them also, the kind of pagdi or safa that you wore also communicated, for instance, your hierarchy or status within a court, or your financial status, or whether you were a member of the mercantile elite or the aristocracy, and so on and so forth. And one more image. Just to give you an example, a textile like that would sort of then get draped into a pagdi. Next slide, please. The exhibition, even though small in scale, was the first of its kind to not only look at the Paithani, but any genre of hand-woven textiles, whether historical or contemporary, from the Deccan, or as often now referred to as the Dakhan. It reflects the broader gap in the histories of its art and architecture in the English-speaking and writing realm, a matter that has begun to be filled only in recent decades. As a small start, the exhibition became the first public outing for research on the Paithani, also initiated by the Twam Foundation about 5 years ago, and one hopes will eventually lead to other exhibitions, publications, and symposia. The first challenge that this exhibition posed was that of speaking about textiles where the creators themselves are not present to speak about what they have created. In most of my earlier exhibitions, which looked at kind of post-independence trajectory, you had a lot of the makers were accessible, or what they had written about their practice was sort of accessible. But here, what do you do? So transitioning from someone who's looking at making exhibitions out of material which is of today to exhibitions that are of the past in a way. In other exhibitions curated by me, the makers, technicians, artisans, craftspeople, designers, and artists become co-creators, in that an understanding of the practices behind the textiles remain accessible. Questions of how to best represent them then becomes a part of thinking about locating exhibits within what are called living traditions, whether collective, of communities, or of studio-based individuals. In the case of historical textiles, one relies on inventory records for information left behind by others, having to find ways to visually and technically read them, a process which imposes great limitations with the self as curator, interpreter, arbitrator, and most uncomfortably that of a historian. The challenge then for this exhibition began with a very definition of the paitani itself. In the case of historical paitanis, while there remains a sort of broad understanding and consensus of what these textiles are now, because they've been shown and catalogued in private and public collections in the country and abroad, few samples actually carry direct provenance to Paitan itself, to having been made in Paitan itself. The term is further used for iterations which have been produced across the Deccan, from Yeola, Chanderi, Gadwal, and Burhanpur. In fact, today the authentic Paitani is considered one from Yeola, not from Paitan, a handloom producing town about a 4 hours drive from Paitan, where its production moved with some weavers taken there from Paitan in the 19th century. While all of these iterations have distinct aesthetics, forming what we may call schools or styles of the Paitani, they are similar in their use of a distinct type of weave, the tapestry technique. It's very similar to the tapestry technique which is used in Europe, and information about the origins of this technique are very obscure. We have very scattered sort of references to how this technique actually emerges and becomes really important in the Deccan. And the only equivalent technical similarities we have are in the shawls of Kashmir, in saris of Kanchipuram, in South India, in Tamil Nadu, and of course in the wider European tapestry making world. In the process of our research, we found samples like these, which are not dated but which have tags which point to their production in Paitan at a government weaving center under the Nizam of Hyderabad, alluding to their period of manufacture being from the pre-independence decades. We see the pattern of bold, blossoming lotuses, which are not seen in any historical samples, indicating a new series of design experiments taking place that are directly inspired. Next slide. From the hand-painted frescoes of the Ajanta caves. So you can see how the blooming lotuses as a creeper kind of then gets absorbed. Ajanta caves are not far from Paitan. They are dated to the early centuries AD. So aside from a decision to stage the exhibition in Paitan to begin with, the next question this led one to was whether it could offer an overview. Because you're looking at a history of Paitan which is 2,000 years, you have historical specimens which are dated to the 19th, 20th century, then you have early 20th sort of century samples like these which are coming out. So do you actually create an overview, a kind of survey? But in an environment where the town's local legends contain their own narratives, what would it mean to generate such an overview where often the emotional and affective idea of the Paitan, so kind of a personal idea of what is the Paitani, is the visceral idea of what is a Paitani to a person is very different from what it is as an object to scholars or to researchers. And often the information that we get from different perspectives conflict with each other. So, what is the emotional idea of a textile that you make, that you've worn, and what you can actually empirically date and process in terms of its kind of material evidence. Visual influences, like we can see here, often also transcend time periods, and a clear chronology is not possible to generate. Is there a possibility of containing both? And in a situation where the weaving of this textile is alive, what purpose would any such attempt within a small local museum gallery serve? The perception in many parts of India, especially in smaller towns, and I find that a lot because a lot of my work is outside of big institutions, it's in independent spaces, it's in smaller towns where production is active, where hand weaving is alive. So the perception in many of these parts is that museums are where dead objects are sent to when they're of no use. Exhibitions in museums in such contexts do not directly elevate objects that are shown here, as is often the case elsewhere. Fairs, festivals, special occasions, celebrations at home and on the streets are so much a part of our everyday life that its ritualistic and material elements rarely fascinate viewers when they are showcased behind vitrines. With how the paitani is designed, woven and sold in the shops and bazaars of Paitan itself, playing out so close to the museum, one chose to offer the 20 textiles in the exhibition then as an archive, expecting the main visitors to be the weavers from the town. And the exhibition became a kind of storage. Not a single textile was hung, with the staging on site just a single layer. The insights of the visitors and the gathering of oral records of the textiles becoming another layer. And in that sense, the opening of the exhibition only marked the beginning of the real research on the subject itself. If we have the next slide, please. So out of the many other layers that are embedded in the exhibition, I'm choosing to talk about two, which were suggested as mere directives, because in an environment where we have just a single dedicated museum of textiles, we do not have a single Indian textile history program. We do not have commercial galleries that show textiles, despite the fact that textiles are being made and produced and used. I mean, 50% of what people are wearing in this gathering are hand-produced or hand-patterned. How do you use these exhibitions as also kind of suggesting pedagogies and intuitively suggesting ways in which textiles should be looked at within wider conversations? So one group of textiles looked at designs in the end panel that actually mimicked a lot of the architecture of Paitan itself. So even today, there is carved wooden architecture which survives from 300-400 years back, and you actually have pillars and architectural elements that mimic what you see in the sari itself. So we created one group of textiles which looked at these kinds of architectural depictions. They are very rare in Indian textiles. You don't find them very commonly. And if we could have the next slide, please. Just to show you a little detail. So actually this is the tapestry weave. And what is very particular about the tapestry weave is that, so the vertical part of making a textile, the yarns that are used vertically or horizontally, the longer part of the threads, is called the warp or the warp threads, and sort of the width, along the width you insert what is called the weft. So what typically happens is that in a tapestry weave, you actually you use one shuttle, which is the mechanism through which you insert the weft from here to here. So for instance, here you have gold metallic thread, and you interlock it with the purple thread. And then you interlock that purple thread, you weave it till here, then you interlock that with the blue thread. Then you take it till here, then that light blue thread interlocks with the gold. So it's actually, it's a continuous system of sort of interlocking. And that allows you to actually independently control every point at which the weft and the warp meet. So it's almost like a pixel. And therefore the great European tapestries and a lot of tapestries that emerge, especially in the Christian realm in Europe, out of churches and all, that depict, that mimic portraiture, So it's possible because you can actually control every pixel in a way. So this is just a detail of one of those textiles. If we could go to the next slide. The kind of wooden architecture that still survives from the 17th century, from the 18th century. And to show you another example of the architecture, the next slide please. The kind of pillared, sort of the kind of pillars that still exist, and they show this relationship that textiles have. So we included a bunch of photographs that were taken in the 1980s and 90s by Dr. Morvanchikar, who is the foremost historian on the history of pattern. And we included them with the textiles as a way for the viewers to be reminded of this connection that textiles and architecture have. And that itself led to thinking about other ways in which we could expand an understanding of textiles, because because of this wealth of architecture and pattern, a lot of the other visitors that come are students of architecture. And so this became also, because we had daily walkthroughs and there was a lot of conversation, we found this as an opportunity to actually address the gap of textile histories in architecture, which is illustrated by the next image. So we have, for instance, next slide please. Very famous architecture from Fatehpur Sikri, Akbar's great capital near Agra. And architecture schools are taught architecture, right? This is architecture, this is great architecture. And none of this includes, for instance, histories of textiles that go with this architecture or the rituals. So, when you look at something like this from the perspective of architecture, you actually think of this as a mere shell. It's very difficult to just celebrate it for itself, because if we see in the next slide, these kinds of shells would have been completely covered with fabric. And that fabric would have changed with seasons, with Mausam, with occasion. So you have the concept of architecture which is traditionally very agile and flexible. And 3 generations of architects in India, if not more, have been taught that the shell is the architecture. There isn't a problem with that. But I think to not then teach or to show that that's a gap was something that we also wanted to address. So every exhibition then, we find ways to contextualize the local visitorship and see how we can, excite a conversation on these gaps. So this, the evidence that we have of this architecture with mirrors, imagery on the textiles, led us to think. So one direction that this exhibition sort of took was that a lot of visitors who came, we would actually take them for guided walks of many of these mansions or varas that survive. These mansions that survive from 300-400 years back of sahukars, a community that actually produced and traded these textiles, and in some cases also wore them. And it was their wealth which actually supported and patronized this kind of architecture. So one direction that this exhibition took was to forge these kinds of intuitive, suggestive reminders of architecture with textile. And the other was, of course, apparel, because Paithani today is a very revered, it's a kind of trophy textile of the region. So in looking at kind of ways to think about it in terms of apparel, we included a set of images, reproductions of oil on canvas paintings and watercolors, of which I'm going to show you one. An image by a well-known Indian artist from the British colonial period, M.V. Dhurandhar. And this image for me became a kind of reference constantly, because what we see is, what we really see, we can identify these textiles that these women are wearing in a gathering like this to be Paithanis. It's from a very particular kind of milieu where the Paithani would have been worn in the late 19th and early 20th century. It's a westernized, English-speaking, sort of landed community, in Maharashtra that would wear these kinds of Paithanis. We see the bride there wearing the yellow. Yellow was usually the sari that was gifted by the mama, by the bride's mother's father. So there's a lot of that kind of information, and mother's brother, I'm so sorry. Mama, yes, that would be Nana. So the Mama gives the bride that. So, you know, this image kind of became very, very exciting for me to keep looking into as a way of being able to imagine what all of these saris could look like in a room. And eventually, like I said, the exhibition was eventually just, it became a storeroom. We actually had to stage the exhibition in literally the storeroom of the museum. The museum has existed forever, except for a few ivory figurines, terracotta objects that have been excavated in Paitan. There's very little there. When we first went there, there wasn't even a Paitani in a museum on Paitan. But then there was a very, very wonderful conversation that led us to with the government, with the archaeology of museums, and you know, eventually they became co-supporters, co-enablers of this project. So this image became very exciting for me to keep going back to, because we have very few images. We have images of individuals wearing such saris. We don't have images of what it feels like to be in a room lush with these kinds of textiles. And you know, and this image kind of related to many aspects of Paitan. You know, you go to Paitan or any other handloom center to buy textiles, there are men who are selling the saris. So they are sort of, you know, they drape the saris and show you how to wear it, and you know, all of that is there. So to be reminded that there was this time that, you know, this was a form of actually women coming together, of actually, you know, that is one layer. The fact that, you know, how they were worn as drapes, there's a lot of that kind of information, and eventually through several kind of ways to try and abstract this, I kind of chose a very simple way to display the textiles in these storage boxes. I'll explain why. We could have the next slide, also the last slide in my presentation, where I try to capture the kind of colors that you see there in a kind of abstract way. So it was almost like trying to create a room full of these Paitanis, of course with the required conservation, conservation boxes and so on and so forth. But the idea was to just be able to kind of capture a glimpse of what it might mean to be in a room full of these kinds of colors and textures. Why storage? And Natasha, maybe we'll discuss that later with reference to the Calico Museum and other instances, because we're really hoping that what began as a 10-day exhibition, which now has become a 5-week exhibition, we're hoping that this becomes a permanent gallery in the museum itself. So while conceiving and working on a brief to create a short-term project, over 5 weeks, we realized in some ways it's been confirmed that, you know, our earlier intention to actually conceive it as a storeroom, which can be open to anyone who wants to come and refer to them to recreate, or to get inspired from, or to technically study, or to read about them. So that was it. So within this kind of temporary exhibition, we inbuilt a kind of design intention of a storeroom that could then become an archive that could continuously get referred to. So with that, I close the presentation, and I hope it offers some food for conversation.
Thank you, Mayank. To dive right in, I wanted to go into an idea that we have talked about, and you just mentioned it in the closing slide, the need for a study collection, and just several such, where textile is not only referred to as illustration or within the family cabinet stored away as too precious to be worn. What really can perform as a textile library. So not only represent, but really, what do you feel can be such a reference point for you in India? Is there such a study collection that you'd refer to that feels important for you in another holding in another part of the world?
Well, in Ahmedabad, we were lucky because I went to design school in Ahmedabad. We had the Calico Museum. And what is exciting about the Calico Museum is that when you enter a gallery, say on Paitanis, you don't see 5 or 10 exceptional pieces, you see 50 of them. And what that does to you is not only does it convey to you the entire, the world of the Paitanis with its many iterations and colors and material variations, but also it kind of trains you in a certain way to look, you know, you kind of, your eye stops to what you like, your eye then moves, then eye stops to something that you don't like. Or so I think that training of having access to the Calico Museum, which had this kind of very different way of experiencing textiles, which was not one textile under kind of, you know, focus light, which didn't give you the context of the entire genre. I think that viewing, and it was at a time where the museum was far more accessible than it is today. So we could actually, as students, also, you know, book to go and spend one afternoon at that time in a gallery. So for me, I think a lot of that understanding of how important it is to see and hold, and hold as in to be close to the textile, really comes from the way the experience of Calico was conceived. And given that most of my work has been with private collectors who are interested in offering their collection as for public viewing or for study, or who are interested in actually building collections that we then create iterations of as exhibitions. I think the centrality of creating collections that you can study is very important. With muslin, which was a recent exhibition, fine count cotton, you actually could feel the fabric and touch it. We had rolls of it, because you hear about all of this extraordinary muslin that was traded from India, and you're told that it's 500 counts and it's 1,000 counts and it's so exceptional, and then you're largely reduced to receiving all of this information and experiencing it on a video. And I think it's important to hold it and to feel it, because I mean, we were at this store the other day and I was telling, it's something that Bashabi actually pointed to me years back. So you always think of fine count cotton as being light. It is lightweight, it's light to look at, but when you buy it, it has to, overall the fabric has to be heavy, because actually it should contain all of that cotton. So all of this information is, you know, is important. I mean, for you to grasp something about textiles, I think it's not possible in only theoretical terms, or it shouldn't be. So I think, yes, there has been an insistence on working with people who are interested in creating collections, study centers, and to activate them through exhibitions or spaces. Yeah.
And having been at NID in a very specific time in the early 2000s, a specific time in which there were certain kinds of pedagogues, design practitioners living, working from there, so not only producing the curriculum, but also finding other ways to publish, other avenues to speak in the public realm around design practice. I wonder, how do you sort of see the shift in what the core curriculum around textile and design practice is today in India, particularly as someone who came from the outside, but who grew up in the city of Ahmedabad, 5 minutes from the museum, the Calico Museum. I felt at that point, as a journalist, just entering this campus of the National Institute of Design, where it felt like one had to, as a student, go into the so-called field and then learn from master makers. So even within that, there is, of course, hierarchy within hierarchies of making. And there still felt a bit more of a divide in terms of going to the weaver, but not knowing that the block maker, this is a bit technical, but just that the block maker for instance, or the printer is not even living in the same geography, but might be living in a suburban or urban context. I think these aspects, I'm curious about how you think about them today, also in hindsight.
Gosh, we have this, it's very much a part of design education in fashion, in apparel, in textile today, that you have to do craft documentation, which means that you have to go in one of your breaks, summer or winter, and spend 2 weeks with someone who produces and record everything, right? And when we were asked to do this, it was so uncomfortable because, would you be given access? You're not only required to document this, you then are meant to give a copy of that documentation to a government institution, an archive, that is not publicly accessible. And then you're expected to apply that learning into a design project, right? So I said no. I said, I can't go to a graphic designer's firm and say, come on, open up your archive, and over 2 weeks I will document everything. I mean, they'll say, get lost, right? So what gives us, what was uncomfortable was what gives us the entitlement to go and expect this. You do not make them co-curators of that research. You merely mention them as a name. It's very violent. It was so violent that, you really didn't, I just didn't respond to it. So instead, I said, I'm going to go to a milieu that I'm more comfortable with. And I landed in Calcutta to study an erstwhile royal collection. Because at least I felt that, there was a kind of conversation that did not reduce me to that kind of, it just reduces you to be a real exploiter, right, in that sense. So I have been very uncomfortable with craft documentation. I have rejected it through my own learning and education, and I reject it today. And I do. I just think that today, and the problem with that is that design was necessarily suggested as something which was a value add to craft. But craft has intrinsically its own design. It has its own thinking about things. Making is research. Making is about conceptualizing and designing and producing all at once. And so actually the process of, for the lack of another word, one calls oneself a curator. But I think my journey really since graduating in textiles from an institution like that has been of unlearning what it was taught to me as to be a designer, which was to be someone who could add value without giving respect or acknowledging an equal contribution of. So overall, I think that sadly, I think a lot of this has got severely reinforced today. And while there is a lot more questioning about it, I think a lot of it is just getting more and more reinforced because the expectation to produce in India from the West has surmounted even more today. So, so we are kind of going back into this kind of idea of just being suppliers to, so it's a big problem. So I have an uncomfort with the entire way in which formal design education in India is set up. And I think the only way one can actually offer an alternative is to say, you know what, forget all of that, go see the textiles, because when you look at them, they're telling you something. It may tell you that the motive is similar in this textile to something that was produced 500 kilometers away or 5,000 kilometers away. But the technicality will tell you something else. So I think for me, education is, originally these were aspects that were inbuilt in design education, but this insistence on, we were told very strongly, this is, you're not an artist, you're going to be a designer, and you're not a craftsperson, so it was, and I think it continues to be something which is very uncomfortable.
Before opening up, could we speak a little bit more to the role of an editorial sort of constellation of research and editing as also a material practice in a sense, the way that you have worked on it, editing as a form of archiving as well in the kind of volumes of publications that you produced?
So I think I started writing about the field because I wanted to write about things that I wanted to read that weren't written about. I mean, whether there were all of these personal histories of faculty at the NID who'd actually set up the NID, or who had seen what had happened in the 60s, 70s, 80s. So I think a lot of the interest in writing and editing was really about putting together material that I didn't have as a maker in the country to refer to. So therefore, I think most of the projects, like I mentioned in the presentation, are survey projects. So whether they are publications that look at post-independence trajectories, whether they're exhibitions that look at the post-independence period, whether they're specific genres like handspun, handwoven textiles, or the paitani or the baluchari. The idea has been to actually create those overviews because they don't exist. You know, and there's been a lot of work on very specific histories and research, but not the overview. So in some ways, what one has tried to really do is create those overviews and surveys, but one has found interesting ways to do those surveys because, I mean, another thing that one has insisted is not getting into formal academics. So the exhibitions and the catalogs with them, or these publications, offer a kind of, if one follows a trajectory of them, they offer a kind of pedagogy. There's a connection between them. You know, something that you leave in an exhibition or a publication gets picked up in the other. But in that aspect, the exhibitions really became a way of creating those references for makers. And you know, so I mean, whether it was the Take on Art fashion issue, which looked at a century of Indian fashion, we actually looked at it through only personal histories. It was not the history of fashion designers, it was not the history of brands and companies. It was really about personal histories and how people were looking at fashion, and we found startling things. So, you know, within the kind of big conversation on khadi and handspun and the freedom movement, we found people who said, you know, they were kids and they were like, we were just dying to wear foreign cloth. We just loved it. Or the Ambedkarites who said that we hate handloom because, you know, if you have to produce it, it is the worst thing that you want to wear. So that was an interest. So one also, through these survey projects, one has found a way to actually look at making them non-survey in a way. You know, the format is non-survey. Or in the design issue that we looked at with Take on Art, I actually included areas that have always been written about as the decorative arts. So instead of looking at design as a post-1960s or post-war phenomena, I included material from the 19th century onwards. Ornamental arts, decorative arts, social design, ways in which considered thinking and interventions have actually translated into material design and community building you know, processes. So one looked at all of these things. So in all these surveys, they actually become ways to think about creating overviews really primarily. And I think I'm writing things that I really have been aching to read about. Ultimately, it's this kind of, I'm writing to feed myself as a maker, you know, in a way.
Let's open. Inti has the first question.
Thank you so much.
I love
Incredible.
how that you were talking about exactly the same thing, right? The Ikat war planes, which you see in Varanasi. And it's incredible because these artisans have actually stored newspaper references. And by this time, you know, radio was in India. So you were actually hearing about the bombings that were taking place in Europe, apart from the fact that India was also at war, right? Because Indian soldiers were at war.
His shirt is no less.
Just a brief comment then, just a question that when you, incredible talk lecture, thank you. When you showed the image of the architecture and and with all the textile on it, cladding in Spanish, and I guess in Portuguese as well. It's called revestimiento. It's like you redress the building, yeah? And it's such a beautiful to see that image. I have a question more, I guess, is more of a practical, even to try to learn a bit from you. When you work and present textiles from living weavers, how do you label it? Like, what is the, or for example, for this show, if there were weavers that were still alive, what is the actual label inside those vitrines? And just to understand.
Yeah, so this was actually the first curatorial project, Fracture, which was at Fracture Indian Textiles New Conversations. And because when you look at all of this material, the designer is mentioned, or the design studio was mentioned. So it was a small, but I think it was a very important kind of decision as part of the curatorial practice that everyone is mentioned as a co-creator. And yes, that has led to artists and designers not wanting to be in exhibitions that one has curated, because they do not want to be seen next to an artisan. So there are people who have not participated. And one deals with that and constantly. But I think since that was in 2015, it emerged out of a 3-year curatorial process. And it was my first show as a curator. It was, and it was, I think, very important. And it upset a lot of artists because it was at the Devi Art Foundation, which is largely known for contemporary art and cutting-edge contemporary art. And it made artists who had shown there uncomfortable that, you know, what, do you expect us now to mention our technicians? And I said, it's your choice, but why not? Because there's intelligence there. So the labeling is all is whoever's involved in making the textile, and as much as information that our sources are able to supply to us, we include that. And sometimes if they're not, we don't include their work as well, because I think it's part of that conversation. I think it begins with naming and giving an acknowledgement to the makers. I personally think it begins there. And it's gone a long way now, because most textile exhibitions now follow that format in India. I mean, apart from the fact that that show was the first such curatorial presentation in maybe 3 decades, since the early 1990s, it's become fairly the norm now. I think if you don't mention it, it's not considered okay. Does that answer your question? Sure. I think there's a question. Sorry, Priyanka, I can't see you because of the projector. So.
Thank you, Mayank, for sharing the works. Just to elaborate that on a bit more, when we speak of, say, ownership of work, and whoever is producing it, curating it, or designing it, the people who are working on the looms, because they're essentially coding the patterns, right? They're coding the design. I want to know the role of GI tagging and like the problems and the benefits there are to them, because I've spoken to a couple of people. I'm not from this industry, so I don't know much about it. But I would love to know from you, somebody who is more aware of everything that is happening here. What are your thoughts? What are the benefits and problems with it, where it is now?
So many prominent handloom producing centers have a GI. And most state governments and the central government actively encourages the GI. But the least number of actual legal cases in the GI realm have been filed within the textile space. Because you have a quota doria, which is known, which has a GI in Rajasthan, but originally comes from Mysore, and even today in Rajasthan is known as the Mysoria. So you have some story about an erstwhile princess who got married to the family in Kota, and with her brought the weavers and the looms, as was often the case, ages back. So you have a Mysoria, which is known even in Rajasthan as the Mysoria, which comes from Mysore but has a GI tag in Rajasthan, Or Chanderi, which is a handloom producing town in Madhya Pradesh in central India, which was among the earliest clusters to actually apply for a GI. And Chanderi today is largely identified through its use of silk, basically silk and cotton. It's not pure silk, right? Now, until the early 20th century, it was entirely cotton. So today you go to Varanasi, and they will sell you Chanderi fabric, not because it's produced in Chanderi, but because it's a type of fabric. So how we refer to things academically, Chanderi, is very different from how the trade term is applied. Because for a trader in Varanasi, Chanderi is the material quality of the fabric. It's the fact that there's silk with cotton. So it's very difficult. I'm not for GI. I don't think it's sufficient to actually define these textile traditions or actually capture their complexity. But in places like, for instance, Pochampalli, which is an ikat producing center in Andhra Pradesh in South India, the handloom weavers have organized themselves to apply for a GI as a way to resist powerloom replication. But when you go to Pochampalli, there's a long street, as in most of these hand-producing villages or towns, and you have like 50 shops on one side, 50 shops. All of them say Patola saris. And Patola is a sari that we know originates from Gujarat, the Patan Patola. So there you have a community that has actually, so these are very interesting dynamics of, so I don't think GI is at all sufficient to actually explain the complexity of the situation. Sorry?
How do you organize? What are you defending actually?
How is it organized? There is a protocol that a community that produces it has to be organized enough. There has to be a certain number of people. They have to prove that there's a history of that textile in the region. Jamdani, which is a tradition of undivided Bengal. The first GI in Jamdani was not from Bengal in India or Bangladesh. Bangladesh has a Jamdani. So technically in a show today, I can't even call something which is produced in the Jamdani technique technically in Bengal. Everyone does it, of course. But I can't technically call it Jamdani. I have to call it extra weft. So I was discussing this with someone in Bangladesh. He said, you are producing extra weft. We are producing Jamdani. But Bangladesh was pushed and they got their act together to apply for a Jamdani because there is a tradition of Jamdani in Andhra Pradesh called the Upada Jamdani. And they got a GI for Upada Jamdani before Bangladesh applied for a... So these boundaries are new. So there has to be a certain number of producers. They have to establish that it has been produced for a certain period of time in the region, that it has a sufficiently distinct visual and material identity, so the kind of motifs, patterns, and so on and so forth.
If I could just add to your conversation, one funny example of this is Baluchari. Baluchari is in Bangladesh. It's made in Bishnupur in large numbers, but the real Baluchari is in Banaras.
It was revived in Banaras in the 50s.
Because the Bengali people couldn't make the Jala system. So I don't know what we are defending by doing all this GI.
So I was told that the least, when we last researched this, that the least number of, unlike haldi, varieties of haldi or turmeric, or basmati rice, or rasgulla now, which is a big, between Orissa and Bengal. So when we last researched, there were the least number of cases, in that sense, disagreements about what a GI is, and therefore, you know, were really in the handloom
Doesn't
space.
basmati belong to someone in Texas?
So I don't
Can
think
we-
it's really
we can-
worked that well.
We're going to keep
Yeah,
moving.
we can ask an online question
Yeah.
now. Before I ask the online question, for those of you who have not been familiar with all the textile that Mayank's talking about and would like to see them right after the presentations, you could actually go to Kanishka's. It has the baluchari, upara, jamdani, patani, whatever. You can touch the textile and feel it. They're all original textiles from the region. So, but coming to the online question, Shubham Vishwas again. I think it's a comment question. Loved your presentation, Mayank. Starting with a snapshot of the 1851 exhibition, how can you not? On a more serious note, your work with the Paitani textiles and the problem of identifying or lacking access to the original creators of the historical textiles reminds me of research on identifying textile patterns on ancient sculptures. Specifically, I'm reminded of how textile patterns on statues of Vishnu and Shiva were missing the bust, but were able to be identified as Southeast Asian because the textile pattern carved into the stone. What kind of scope does work like that have in furthering research in Indian sculpture from earlier eras? Also, could such patterns be traced to find the extent of Paitani textiles in other mediums around the world, in the places you mentioned which treated pattern? Thanks so much.
It's a question. It's a long. No, I mean, since to quickly answer, since Professor Moti Chandra, he was the last historian who actually looked at Indian historical material, art, miniature paintings, and actually put together an understanding of Indian textile and dress. Since then, we've not had any dedicated scholar. I think the last book that was written in great detail was by Ritu Kumar, which was more than 20 years back on the textiles and costumes of Royal India. So there's a severe gap in people who are actually researching the historical material from the history of textile and dress. The big problem there is that patterns can travel, patterns travel, and we know they travel. But it's very difficult. So, all those extraordinary Gandhara Buddha images with those gossamer textiles and those beautiful drapes, you assume that they are muslin and cotton because they're so fine, but what if they were silk? There's silk which is as fine. What if it was pashmina? I mean, all of this was on a part of a trade route, the Buddhist trade route that was, so there's a part of the Silk Route which was also actually very active in this region other than the main route, which was through the Buddhist network. So the problem is that we do not have contemporary fabric evidences to corroborate that kind of material, right? That's the big problem.
Just two questions could be related. So what do you think is the future of the sari, one? And number two is, do you think it's enough that the designs survive, or that they survive as they existed originally, as a sari or as a ghagra or whatever? Or, like say, what he's got on his shirt, the design is surviving, but it's not surviving in its original context. I'm just asking, what's your opinion on that?
I love his shirt. I'm sorry I haven't complimented you on it earlier, but I love it. Well, I think in the sample that I showed of the sari from the private collection with the warplane motif in Varanasi, we find numerous examples of textiles that are absorbing contemporary imagery constantly, whether it's design, whether it's change in form, whether it's... So actually I was terrified of becoming a historian that had to look at stuff that, you know, that I've always been uncomfortable at looking at material in the past. Because I think it's so exciting to see what people are doing today, and that's really my entry into the field, was to actually look at fill the gaps of contemporary histories or near histories, near recent histories. But the more you actually look and you dig, you know, you find evidence that textiles have constantly, if they've evolved, you know, and that's, so I mean, that's the thing, right? When we refer to tradition, typically, especially in the design discourse, because designers have to show that they're doing something useful, all of them define their work as contemporarizing tradition. And, you know, that makes you think of tradition as something which is static. But if you look at, I mean, I speak Hindi, I speak Gujarati, we write in Devanagari, both of the, I mean, Hindi is written in Devanagari, and you have, the closest word to tradition I could find was parampara. Now, what does parampara mean? That when you're walking, you can't lift one foot if the other foot is not at rest. It actually intrinsically implies movement. So that's also the problem, because so much, all of this is in the English-speaking realm. And one of the exciting things actually for me as a learner has been to actually understand the limitations of English in writing, and because every exhibition we do, whether it's Chirala in Andhra Pradesh, whether it's Coimbatore in Tamil Nadu, whether it's Hampi in Karnataka, whether it's Jaipur in Rajasthan, whether it's Jodhpur, now Paitan, we translate. And you understand that English just can't capture the information and the implications of words. So, you know, some of these things are also, so tradition implies that there's constant innovation and evolution. It does not imply a static. So I think some of these things also become like far more glaring when the role of the designer has to be like really qualified, because, you know, how else do you actually, you know, so I think these things will survive as long as people are wearing them and using them. They have survived. You have, I mean, the motif that you see on his shirt is very Gyasar-like, you know, the motive is from Qasim does. So basically, Gyasar is a tradition, for those of you who are not familiar, is a tradition of Indo-Tibetan brocades that originally were produced in China for Tibetan monasteries. And at some point that trade got disrupted, and samples, merchants bearing those samples came to Varanasi in the third quarter of the 19th century. And families started producing the Gyasar. It would travel through Newari merchants in Nepal and Kalimpong to Tibet. And a lot of that imagery is actually originally Buddhist. You know, so what he's wearing is actually a version of the Gyasar. Today the Gyasar is a sari. Traditionally it was only woven on very small width looms. Now they've been able to weave it on looms. So there's, I mean, innovation is, I mean, look at that Paithani sari, it's like psychedelic. I mean, it's being worn to a rave, you know, it's not, yeah, I mean, what is traditional about any of this, you know, so, or it's Beyonce, you know, like a nephew of mine, he looked at all of, he said, there's so much gold, it's like Beyonce. So, I mean, this is so, in some levels, we think of this as traditional, but it's not.
I just wanted to make a comment, you know, our family has, apart from all the work we do here, our family has a 5-decade history in textile, and one of the things that I think is the biggest challenge is the master weaver and what's his vision right now, because they're really not, you know, we don't remunerate our artisans in any of the crafts or weaving, you know, industries in the country in the way they need to be. And as a result, and I'm going to be quite specific with a case in point, so Kanishka Raja, who's the late artist, had access to weavers and found this one maverick master weaver who became his close, you know, sort of collaborator, co-thinker in a body of work. Very, very important body of work. And those who have seen it, who understand textile, realize the complexity of that particular weaving. Now this master weaver, after he did that body of work for almost 8-9 years, could not make any more saris, running yardage. He would not make. He was getting into this sort of zone, and then later on, you know, a couple of years he tried whatever, and then the pandemic hit, and he really went, you know, towards like almost nothingness. We didn't even know that when we found out, of course. Now lifelong he's going to be supported by Kanishka Raja's trust, and you know, and he will be fine. But these people also lose complete like path. So I don't know, when you talk about contemporary textile, what's going to be our brilliant textiles next? We're all talking about the entire presentation.
So you know, you
We're all-
have, sorry.
No, I'm saying we're all rooting in history, which is very important also. But what about the future of absolutely out of the ordinary weaving? What are we thinking? What are we doing about that?
Well, you know, the most important thing, to come back to your question, Nandita, is the question of caste. Most weavers and hand producers are at the lowest end of the caste hierarchy. I know weavers who are so exceptionally rich now. They have made so much money in the trade. And they say our sons don't get wives. Nobody wants to marry our sons because no matter how much money we have, you know, we have big cars standing outside our home. We have 4. Some of them are making museums because they now don't have to sell their best works. They now are holding back their work. It's exceptional, the kind of financial success and recognition they've got. They say no women want to marry a weaver's son. We'd rather have someone who's in any. They may be working in a call center. They may be in a corporate job. They may be in a security company. They may do all kinds of things, but nobody wants to marry. So you know, a lot of this cannot change unless we think about the caste system in a more careful way, and think that. But you know, for every tradition which is dying, Priyanka, we've also seen new traditions come up. So one of my shows was called New Traditions, because so Uttarakhand, which is the lower Himalayas in India, traditionally most communities wove for self-consumption. Now because forest-based livelihoods are reducing, you know, the resources, they're no longer that reliant on forest-based livelihoods. They are now producing for the market. So you have a new tradition of handlooms which has been born in Uttarakhand, which didn't exist earlier. And so, you know, for all of that, you know, I mean, I personally think if the machine can make something that the hand makes as equally good, the hand should make it. The hand needs to make something that the machine can't replicate. That's what I feel. That's my personal opinion. But there is still the context that there are places where it offers a means of everyday livelihood because you don't have electricity. So if you have handlooms for which you don't need electricity, the number of hours that you have in the day. So the contexts are so varied, right? You have these new traditions, and then you have dying traditions, and then like embroidery in India. It is better today. The innovation, the craftsmanship is better than even historical samples. And that's why the whole world is sourcing from India, all the couture houses. So, you know, you also have areas where there is, you know, there's such success. So I feel like if you have a person who's willing to buy better, whatever, you know, at a higher value, if you have that strata, and that strata, at least in the Indian economy, is increasing, you know, I think you have a future, and the arbitrators will not be required in 10 years from now. We have friends who are master weavers who are in Varanasi. Their daughters are now PhDs in textiles. So, you know, the thing is, they have access to the market. The scene is going to change. Arbitrators are just not going to be required. We're going to go back to systems which existed pre-British rule, where, you know, you had guilds, you had successful master weavers, you had ustads, you had collective making, you had individual artists, you had judgment. It was a very complex field, you know, something we've spoken about in Varanasi too. So I think that...
I think the panel discussion think we need to round up, and we can join in for the concluding round at 5 o'clock. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.